Everybody, this is Dream, and today we have a nice 5-game NBA slate for you. Before I get started, can you guys smash that like and subscribe button? It really helps the channel a lot. We do have an interesting injury report today. I will get into that in just a second. We also have some good core plays, and we have some nice value today. At least it looks like at this point. So we'll have to wait and see how these things play out. But I do think we have a really solid slate today. Looking at the injury report, we have the Wizards with Gafford out and the Knicks with Robinson out. I will note for the Wizards, Marvin Bagley should be joining the team. For the Chicago Bulls, Pat Williams is out, or sorry, is questionable, and so is Desamu, and then Craig is out. For the Raptors, Siakam has been traded, and Podol is out. I will note that with Toronto, it doesn't appear that Brown will be with the team yet. Looking at Oklahoma City versus Utah, neither of these teams have any injuries whatsoever. For the Memphis-Minnesota game, the Grizzlies have Morant, Bain, Smart, and Rose all out. For the Indiana Pacers-Sacramento game, the Pacers have traded Brown, Halliburton, Mathurian, Nesmith, and Toppin are all questionable, and Siakam does not look like he'll make a debut today. Sacramento is also in good shape today. So we do actually have a couple of interesting situations, as we do have two players in Marvin Bagley here, being one of them, as well as Thaddeus Young. It looks like both these guys should be the starting center for their respective teams due to the situations there. However, Bagley would be the first game with Washington since he's been traded there, and Thaddeus Young, while he has started a couple games, he hasn't played very much in minutes throughout the season. I didn't make them core plays for that reason, but I will talk about both of them in just a minute. My two core plays are Jalen Brunson. Brunson has been extremely consistent lately. He has been over 40 fantasy points in 14 of the last 16 games. He's missed 2 games in the last few as well, and his last game was his first game back after 2 games. I do expect him to continue having really solid opportunities with a max amount of minutes, so I do expect him to be good today. As you can see, his minutes have been pretty high for most of the season, so I do like his upside in this matchup, and his price is pretty good. Looking at Julius Randle, he's also in a great spot. He's played very well with Mitchell out, and he looks like he's been in a great. He's been trashing Washington this season already. In the 2 games, he's averaged 52 fantasy points. I look for a similar type of game today. He has been a little bit more inconsistent and had a low game against Orlando, but I expect him to bounce back and have an absolutely monster game here. He did have a good game against Houston in his last game as well, which is definitely good for his potential here. I expect him to get at least 20 actual points and hopefully a double-double, which will help him pay off. As for Marvin Bagley, we are going to look at him because it looks like he should start at center. Now, this will be his first game with Washington, so with Gafford out, he should move into the starting lineup, and if that's the case, he will become a very good play. As throughout the season, he started 10 games for Detroit, and in those 10, 7 of them he paid off getting over 20 fantasy points, which is what he needs today. And then 3 of the games where he played over 30 minutes, he was 3 for 3 in those as well. So that is a small sample size, but he definitely has a lot of upside in this matchup. I do think the Knicks are a little bit decently tough against big guys, but I think he'll be fine here. He did play 1 game against the Knicks with Detroit where he played 14 minutes, and he did manage 14 fantasy points. I think he's going to be capable of a decent game in this one. So he's definitely in play on this slate. He was very close to being a core play, so to keep that in mind. And if we get more news that he will be the starter, then he will move into being a core play. Looking at Thaddeus Young, he's in a similar situation with Siakam being traded. He looks like he'll be forced into a more prominent role here. He's been good in stretches when he's had these type of situations, and in the last 4 games, he's played more as a result of Podol being out, and with that, he's played pretty well in this stretch. So I think he's got some good opportunity here to have a 25 or more minute game. As you can see, in the last 5, he's had 4 over 19 fantasy points, and he's only $3,900. So he's a great value play on the slate, and he is very close to being a core play as well. Looking at some secondary plays, we're going to look at Jaren Jackson Jr. Oopsie, Jaren Jackson Jr. Now, he is a GPP play for me, as he has been inconsistent throughout the season. The matchup and situation have been solid for him throughout the season. However, he doesn't seem to always, do what's necessary to get himself going and have a big game. But he's been doing better lately, so maybe he'll continue that, especially with a lot of the guards out. His usage should be high, as he is shooting a lot of shots, but he's having a lot of low field goal percentage games, and sometimes his peripheral stats have been inconsistent. But as long as he can get a decent chunk of peripheral stats like rebounds, assists, blocks, and steals, he should be capable of a big game here. And he definitely has that 50 fantasy point upside, and he's nice and cheap. So that definitely gives him some utility on the slate. But he is squarely a GPP play because of that low floor. Looking at Isaiah Hartenstein, he's played extremely well with uh, Mitchell Robinson out, and I expect him to continue that trend. However, his price has come up some, so he's not a core play or anything anymore, as he's too expensive to be reliable from that perspective. But he's still having a lot of solid games, and his price isn't so high that he's unplayable, because he's had a lot of 40 fantasy point games through this stretch. So he's definitely capable of solid games, and this is a great matchup for him. In the 2 games against Washington this season, he's averaged 31 total fantasy points, which is a little bit lower. He needs 33.5 today. So, but I do think he's capable of that, as he's doing that in most games with him starting. Looking at R.J. Barrett for Toronto, with Siakam moved out, and the fact that he's starting and playing a lot of minutes, he's got a lot of opportunity here to have a solid game. He's also a little bit cheaper than Emmanuel Quickly is today, so that gives him a little bit more upside, especially with him having that big time fantasy potential. He only needs 33 fantasy points to pay it today, and with Siakam gone, his usage should go up a little bit more, and he is definitely capable of these big games. His floor is right around 25 or so fantasy points, which is a little lower than we'd like at his price point, which is why he is a secondary play and not a core play. Looking at Emmanuel Quickly, he's actually a little bit more expensive than Barrett today, which is somewhat surprising, but he's been a little bit more consistent fantasy-wise since he's joined Toronto, as he's starting and he's getting a lot of upside. However, his price has come up quite a bit, so that definitely limits him a little bit. And he doesn't have quite the high ceiling that Barrett does, but he also doesn't. And he does tend to be scoring dependent too sometimes, because he's a 3-point shooter a lot of times. But he's playing very well, and while his role is expanded with Siakam gone, his role should actually expand a little bit more, and he's definitely a viable option on the slate. Looking at Vucevic for the Chicago Bulls, his price has come down and been somewhat inconsistent recently. However, he has been up and down throughout the season. His floor is a lot lower than like, but he's still capable of these big monster games, which he has been doing several times recently. And this matchup definitely is favorable, especially with Toronto not having Podol. He is averaging 30 fantasy points a game against Toronto so far this season in 2 games. With this game, he being on the road, he's actually played better on the road throughout the season, so that might actually benefit him a little bit unusually. But I still think he's a solid play, though he definitely carries some risk, as he's not as cheap as I'd like him to be, considering his ups and downs throughout the year. And the Bulls are also just not playing very good. Some other value plays to look at is Gary Trent Jr., Keegan Murray, Xavier Tillman, Luke Kennard, Chris Dunn, Jacob Gilliard, and Isaiah Jackson. Those are guys I would also look at considering, but they're still all pretty risky. As for the 5 games, 2 games have a 240 or more point total, and that's Oklahoma City and Utah, and Indiana and Sacramento. I suspect that stacking these teams is definitely a way to go about it. Indiana is interesting, as they do have a lot of questionable tags, and if Halliburton was to be back, he would definitely become an interesting play. As such, I think both those games have some utility in the stretch, but I do think Sacramento and Utah are a little bit overpriced, as well as Oklahoma City. Looking at the Washington New York Knicks game, I feel like this game has a lot of upside. It's also the third highest scoring game on the slate, and it's a lot higher than the 2 low scoring games, so it's definitely got some potential, especially considering Washington doesn't play defense very much, and they have some utility here. Looking at the Chicago Toronto game and the Memphis Minnesota game, I do like a couple players from those games, but they definitely carry some risk, as they are pretty low scoring, and even though there's some guys that are out or questionable, there's not a ton to love outside of some of the guys that are going to get increases due to other guys being out. So I do think that those games are a little bit more risky, but Toronto is definitely a team that's favorable, as Chicago has not played very well. Looking at that Minnesota-Memphis game, that game is pretty avoidable outside of Jaren Jackson. Even the value plays like Gilliard and Tillman and Kennard have somewhat of a high risk situation, as they look like they might get blown out in this one. So with that said, guys, thank you for liking, comment, subscribing. If you have any comments or questions, feel free to leave them below, and have a nice day, guys.